Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to see you, or not exactly see you, of course, but it's very important for all of us that you're here, and I'm sorry we're meeting under such difficult circumstances. I think this is an appropriate time to consider the limits of human mastery, of science and knowledge, which have been at the center of the interests of the Birkbeck Critical Theory Summer School for many years, but especially given the fervor and brazen knowingness with which so many of those in power are making their appeal to all three. At first glance, the pandemic feels like an act of violence that has come from nowhere, has no clear origin, is limitless in its effects, respects no borders, makes no distinction between human subjects. At the same time, it is no less ruthlessly discriminating, as it exposes the social and racial fault lines of the world. In fact, it is bringing them even more acutely to the surface, allowing us to see more clearly some of the ways violence is organised and distributed in the world. To take a key example very much at the forefront of political awareness, the simple but glaring fact that BAME, Black, Asian and minority ethnic subjects in the UK are 4 times more likely than whites to die of COVID-19. And key sections of the UK report into this reality were censored from its original publication. In particular, the call for action to redress inequality and the finding that racism is a cause of this disparity in deaths. And the official reason given for the censoring was that they feared it would stoke racial tension, as if the refusal to countenance this truth were not part of the pattern that provoked those tensions in the first place. Now, if exposing this truth of Western economists has been critical, it has in turn been accompanied by forms of denial which work to suppress the persistence of historic violence in our times: racial slavery, apartheid in the 20th and ongoing in the 21st century, accelerating gender-based violence, increasing disparity of wealth and privilege. In these remarks, I want to try and look a bit more closely at this relationship between the exposure of injustice and denial, the vicious cycle in which they are caught, and which the pandemic seems to me to have brought to something of a crisis point. I'm going to start with Camus. Albert Camus, whose 1947 novel, The Plague, the sales have increased in the UK by 1,000% since the start of the pandemic, and you could not get a copy of this book for months on end for love or money in English. I'm going to give you a quote from what The Plague does in that book by way of revelation to the hearts and bodies of man, and I'll come back to that man later. This is the quote. "It was as if the earth on which our houses were planted was being purged of its secret humours, thrusting up to the surfaces the abscesses and pus clots that up till then had been doing their work internally. Imagine the amazement of our little city, hitherto so tranquil and now shaken to its core in a matter of days, like a healthy man who all of a sudden feels a revolutionary surge in his thick blood. If the pandemic is at one and at the same time indiscriminate, no respecter of borders, and a moment that is raising to the surface of our consciousness the fault lines of our world, then of course one of those fault lines will be gender. So we must also surely ask, as I will be touching on also in these remarks, is the pandemic gendered? And as the daily bombardment of numbers continues, one chilling statistic is starting to receive attention: the rising numbers of women who, as a consequence of lockdown, have become the victims of domestic violence with no exit. On April the 4th this year, a 700% increase in calls was reported by Refuge, the UK's largest domestic abuse charity, in a single day. Between the 23rd of March and the 6th of April, 10 women were killed by men, as compared to 3 per month before. Imagine a scenario where your only option as a woman is to stay silently locked in a home where your life might be at risk, or travel to a place where you do not know if you will or will not survive. Although it has received little commentary, this is more or less where Camus' novel The Plague begins. It opens when the wife of Dr. Bernard Rieu, doctor and it turns out narrator of the story, in search of a cure for her tuberculosis, leaves for a sanatorium in the surrounding mountains where she will die. Rieu's mother arrives on the day of her departure and stays with her son as the silent, self-effacing companion to support him in a struggle in which it soon becomes clear she will have no role to play. Tarrou, diary keeper, companion and plague combatant alongside Rieu, describes the death of his own mother, having talked about how much he appreciates the self-effacement of Rieu's mother. He talks about the death of his own mother 8 years before as, quotes, her only effacing herself a trifle more than usual. These women have been in lockdown for a long time before the real story begins. Rereading Camus' novel as the statistics on violence against women started to soar, it occurred to me that the term is a pretty good way of describing not only the lives of women in the book, but also the lives of so many women in the 1940s and 50s, when, as Camus was writing his novel, stifling domesticity was the norm. Much, we could say, has changed since then, but then again, not much. I find myself asking whether women are now in double jeopardy, subject to a form of violence which before the crisis they at least had a chance to escape. But perhaps also the targets of something else, a type of revenge or punishment, backlash as it is called, for the fact that most, if not all women in today's normal, i.e. non-virus run of things, being locked down, shut in, isolated in the home, is no longer the case. These women are first and foremost scapegoats for the awfulness of the hour. They are surely being punished for failing to secure the forms of life and care for which they are held accountable, for failing to avert the fragility of human life, but they are also being murdered for their hardly won freedom. In a recent webinar on the psychoanalytic resonances of the viral situation, Julia Kristeva spoke of femicide as an explosion of rage against women for failing to protect men against the fragility of life, for which women, of course, have always been historically held accountable. Reading about the women whose only option today is to be trapped in their homes with an abusive partner, I was brought up against some of the most negative implications of what is going on today. Hard to be optimistic for women, except perhaps insofar as this virus, just as it does in the novel, is making us newly alert to and responsible for the worst of what we see. The plague is therefore revelatory of the secrets of the city, what Camus will describe explicitly as injustice, of the cruelty for women of the daily dispensation of the norm, although it must be said that I don't think Camus was on that page at all. He didn't realize, as it were, what he was describing. He wasn't protesting on behalf of women. Now, let's turn now to two areas where the reality of historic and ongoing violence and the denial are especially acute, both of which are at the core of national belonging, and which I will be talking about later in these remarks. First of all, at the border. The issue of migration as one of the ongoing crises of sociality in our time. Secondly, historical memory, as focused by the murder of George Floyd, as continuum and repetition of racial violence in the US and the UK, an issue which has become acute over the past years in apartheid South Africa, a nation which believed that it had left the worst ugliness of its history behind, and which was the origin of the Rose Must Fall campaign, which the pandemic has so dramatically, and it looks mostly successfully, reactivated. I'm referring, of course, to the dumping of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol, and the struggles now also against a newly emboldened resurgent far right, self-styled statue defenders, to which it has given rise. It is, of course, because the pandemic is revealing the truth of social and racial inequality that the denial and the anger is also being ratcheted up so intensely in response. Since I'm really interested in the relationship between injustice and denial, let's already note in relation to the question of the border that this issue produced one of the moments of most visible floundering on the part of Boris Johnson when asked about no recourse to public funds, the rule for undocumented migrants falling in their thousands into destitution, a state of affairs of which he claimed to be ignorant, one of the moments when he lost any command he lays claim to and was visibly not in control. And we might contrast this floundering with the two mantras with which his government has claimed to manage the pandemic, both equally fraudulent: follow the science, and then the formula take back control, which has been at the core of his Brexit-led strategy, a strategy put under acute strain by the pandemic, which is at the same time being used to drive through Brexit in its most acute and dangerous form as no deal. Not, as is being suggested, by slipping this possibility of no deal under the wire of the pandemic in the hope that no one will notice, but rather as a means of defying it brazenly against all the odds, which has been one of the characteristic lines of behaviour, not only of Boris Johnson, but also of Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil. Both formulas follow the science, take back control, appeal to forms of knowledge and mastery, the emptiness of which have rarely been so visible. We appear to have a government who is managing to succeed in the trick of having the answers to everything and not knowing what they are talking about. And we might here evoke, after Lacan, the psychoanalyst, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, the category of the sujet supposé savoir, or subject supposed to know, a delusional category which it is one of the main aims of psychoanalysis to dismantle. And I would also want to add in here, again to refer to the discussion with Julia Kristeva, what she called the central phobic knot, le noyau central phobique of human subjects, which is the radical fragility into which we are all born, a fissure in human identity which the pandemic is bringing to the surface of consciousness. Now, just before I go on, I want to pick out two quotes from Hannah Arendt, which seem very relevant to my theme and which help me whenever I try and think about anything I need to think about, basically. And the first one is when she talks of the alien as alien in quotes, by the way, as a frightening symbol of the fact of difference as such, of individuality as such, and then says, and indicates those realms in which man cannot change and cannot act, and in which therefore he has a distinct tendency to destroy. Cannot change, cannot act, therefore destroy. And the second one is at the time when Nixon was describing America as the pitiful, helpless giant after its crushing defeat in Vietnam. She wrote, "It remains hard to reconcile oneself to so much effort wasted on the impotence of bigness, though one may well welcome this unexpected grand-scale revival of David's triumph over Goliath." Now, note how both of these quotations establish a relationship between violence and impotence. That is, both of them suggest that denial is not an afterthought of violence, but an inherent component of how it works, or what it has to believe in order to enact itself. Now, before turning in more detail to the issue of violence at the border and the historical memory of violence in South Africa, I want to make a detour, which is not really a detour, since it is so germane to our topic, via the political philosopher, some of you will know his work, of Howard Kegel, one essay from his forthcoming book of essays, Force and Understanding, Writings on Philosophy and Resistance, to be published by Bloomsbury later this year. And one in particular I have found particularly helpful in thinking about where we are. It's called The Predicaments of Philosophy, Violence and Civility. So I'm going to take a good 10 minutes or so just to take you through this essay, because I think it is so helpful in trying to understand this strange relationship between violence enacted and violence repudiated, which I feel we're witnessing as a result of the pandemic. Okay, this is the epigraph to the essay. They both, for the first time, became aware that they lived in conditions where the unusual may be dangerous, and that there was no power on earth outside of themselves to stand between them and the unusual. They became uneasy, went in, and loaded their revolvers. That's from Joseph Conrad's An Outpost of Progress. Now, Kegel argues there is the most intimate link between the predicaments of philosophy in relation to doubt and knowledge, and a refusal to acknowledge the violence of empires. Is this world, he asks, the realization of philosophy's universalist aspirations? Is philosophy complicit with the European project of violent imperial expansion? Or is the course taken by world society nothing to do with the ideals of philosophy, or at worst their grotesque perversion? I'm sure you will already guess what answer he is going to give to this question. Christian moral freedom, Kegel observes after Hegel, could only become certain of itself and its inner spiritual possessions by means of the violent subjugation of the infidel at the borders of Christendom. Later, this dilemma between inside and outside will acquire new urgency and accrete more violence in the context of Protestant subjectivity and the emergence of nationhood. The Protestant subject could only discover certainty, or rather was driven to secure certainty within himself in the context, Kegel writes, quote, of the fragile and contradictory civility established within the borders of the nation-state. He continues, the possibility of feats of extravagant and unrestrained violence at the borders of the modern nation-state have historically contrasted with the constraints of rational management of violence within the borders of the nation-states. To put it simply, Violence at the border serves a purpose, and so does the shock it provokes. It obscures the violence of the internal social arrangements of modern nations, which fight to preserve the legitimacy of their conquests and the privilege of the few over the many, which accompanies it. Now I realize I've made some historical leaps here, and I will not go through all the stages of this dense and vital argument. Obviously this is a plug for this essay and the book, but I would want to pick out the link he establishes so convincingly between the category of doubt, as it will subsequently emerge at the core of European philosophy from the time of Descartes, and historic violence. In this reading, doubt is less a form of liberation from religious tradition and regulation, although it's also that, but it's more like a form of damage limitation, a strategy for managing the unacknowledged violence which followed and accompanied, quote, the reconfiguration of Christendom into competing nation states. Doubt, he writes, is not just a theoretical luxury indulged in a warm bohemian retreat during a lull in campaigning, but figures, listen to this, but figures the guilt and anxiety surrounding possession secured by violence. Note that already violence is seen as both constitutive of the social order and an object of fervent denial. Indeed, the necessity of violence invokes denial twice over. Denial of the founding violence of possession, denial of uncertainty, that is, the inability of European man to master the world or himself. And some of you will already recognize how this leads straight to the work of Sigmund Freud. And you might also, I hope, have heard the resonances for what we are witnessing today. One, first, in that quote by Conrad, the idea that the unusual is experienced as a danger to which the response is to load your revolver. Gun sales have rocketed in the US since the lockdown. Secondly, the history of violence that underpins the European continent and the United States in relation both to their past and the ongoing exploitation of the global South. A history that has erupted in relation to the killing of George Floyd. These demonstrations carry several demands. Justice for Floyd and the black American men who are being killed on the streets in the United States and in prison cells in the UK, plus a change in police training, including a legal ban on the chokehold in the US, which has been granted. First-degree murder charge against Derek Chauvin, the killer of Floyd, originally charged with third, now raised to the second degree, but Chauvin is still eligible, I discovered, for a $1.5 million pension, whatever the decision is against him. And in the UK, immediate suspension of all officers involved in custody death. An end to centuries of institutionalized racial discrimination and structural inequality. Acknowledgement of the racial violence of American history, and for those of us insisting that it will not do to say, well, of course it is worse in the US than the UK, recognition of the part played by the UK in the history of slavery and its imperial dominions. Slave owners were apparently paid approximately $20 million in compensation and over 40,000 awards for enslaved people freed in the colonies of the Caribbean, Mauritius and the Cape of Good Hope, according to a government census that named all owners as of August the 1st, 1834. Now, faced with these realities, the only response should surely be not a denial of this history, but its continuing excavation, which is why the issue of the school and university curriculum is so urgent. The conflict on the streets of America, writes Adam Schatz in a recent essay in the London Review of Books, has its origins in the American colonies, in the first slave patrols created in South Carolina in the early 18th century, which tracked down runaway slaves and prevented slave revolts through the strategic use of terror and imposed labor disciplines. And of course, this story is not over. So, the unusual as danger, the loading of guns, the violence of history, from the American colonies to black men killed on the streets, plus, thirdly, and no less crucial, the denial of that past on both sides of the Atlantic on display right now, in the violent right-wing riposte to any suggestion that there might be a shameful history to be acknowledged. Hence the importance for me of Kegel's emphasis on guilt and anxiety as constitutive of the modern enlightened subject, at war with a knowledge which would, to put it at its most simple, spoil his image of himself. Doubt, Kegel writes, as a focus for the management of guilt, is transformed into the open management of violence. To put it more simply, guilt over expansionist violence serves to uphold and increase the quotient of violence in the world by denying and occluding the fact of its existence. In this process, philosophy is deeply and irrevocably implicated. Only through an act of violence, writes Hegel, is it possible to secure our judgment. Quote, the human space and time decreed by Kant is tainted by violence and insecurity. It is a space of insecure possession and a time of insecure finitude. And he continues, it just goes on. I mean, it's a brilliant essay. I hope I'm convincing you of that. And he continues, the predicaments of philosophy are shown to be founded on certain practices of exclusion, practices of a formation of subjectivity which does not recognize the violence of its acts of exclusion, but instead couches them in the language of reason. Okay, to make an utterly insane leap, better than a falsely rational one, laying violent claim to its own certainty, so to make an insane leap, I would say that the refusal and or complete inability of the UK government and the US and the Brazilian, to take the most egregious examples, to apologise for the number of deaths that have fallen to their watch, is not just a desperate bid to avoid censure and to hold on to office, but in direct proportion to the contamination of that office for which they are so manifestly culpable, it is rather a bid to outlaw any process of thought that would suggest that for 1 second that the so-called normal arrangements of the culture are other than benign. Hence the repeated insistence on the return to normal as the ideal to be aimed for, a notion of which Freud again should make us deeply suspicious, and the speed with which in the UK Johnson and his cabinet have tarred the race protests after Floyd with the brush of thuggery and vandalism, not helped by use of the word victimisation by Boris Johnson to describe the consequences of the racism as he launched his Commission of Inquiry into UK racism, which I think we can all be sure will more or less lead nowhere. And in fact, as I was writing this, preparing these remarks for you, as if on topic, the politician appointed by Number 10 to set up the commission is on record as having stated that she does not believe there is such a thing as institutional racism, and she's critiqued previous inquiries for fostering a culture of grievance. So we can just, it's dead in the water, basically. I'm in fact tempted to say that every time Johnson opens his mouth, he is digging his own grave. But then I risk the opprobrium that has fallen on the head of the UK actress Miriam Margolyes, who dared to say that when Boris Johnson was ill, she found herself wanting him not to recover. It did not seem to help that she also said that this was a thought of which she was not proud. Transparently, the aim is to preserve and enshrine beyond reproach, and here I'm using shorthand, the racist legacy of Winston Churchill. All of which serves to absolve the government and its obsequious cabinet twice over of any guilt for the nation's violent past, for the death-dealing cruelty massively exacerbated by government policies of the pandemic. Despite the mantra we follow the science, there is of course no one science to follow. But on one thing scientists seem to be in total agreement. If lockdown had started 1 week early, 20,000 lives could have been saved. Half the total to date. I would want to add to Hegel Chris Davis' notion of the phobic core or crux of human subjectivity. One thing the pandemic is doing, perhaps most simply, is putting everyone in touch with the possibility of their own death, for which, as Freud famously put it, there is no notion in the unconscious. For those who thought Johnson's brush with death might have made him more cautious or thoughtful, we should note the speed with which it was greeted as a sign of his strength of character. He is a fighter, as one minister put it, with the ugly, vicious implication that all those who've died from the virus were not. Instead of which, those of us who survived might rather see that the best way of honouring those who died is to hold death as part of all of our lives, rather than guilt-stricken and terrified, banish death to the furthest borders of our minds, which means, among other things, ignoring the privilege that has so unfairly distributed it amongst us. Of one thing we can be sure: if we take that path of blindness, the inequalities and injustice of the present will, if the pandemic comes to an end, surely worsen. We are therefore, as if bringing Hegel's argument to life, daily witness to a language of pseudo-rationality in denial of its own guilt, a guilt which goes way back to the foundations of modern civility and whose contortions of self-denial are becoming clearer by the day. What cannot be admitted by those in power is, to quote Hegel once more, the notion of a finite subjectivity in the throes of suffering, its insecurity and fear of death. What we appear to be witnessing is that this failure to acknowledge human insecurity in the face of suffering and death, which Hegel makes the predicament of philosophy, increases in direct proportion to the persistence of death amongst us. After Arendt, Hegel is arguing that the mass deaths of 20th century Europe represented the recoil of imperial violence onto the metropolitan states, the return of the repressed, one might say. In this light, the arrival of the pandemic might be seen as bringing the violence of the modern city-state home to roost. Now, interestingly, and it might just be that I was reading the Hegel and the Camus, or rereading the Camus, I first read it when I was 17, at the same time, that I was really struck by the connection between Hegel's argument and the way, at a key moment in the novel, Camus allocates responsibility of the plague to state violence. And it's a moment when Tarrou, the chronicler, is recounting his personal story and his most disturbing childhood memory, which was when he watched in the courtroom as his father, a prosecuting attorney, convicted a convict to death. His head must fall. The man was clearly guilty and horrified at what he'd done. He looked like an owl, blinded by too much light. His tie was awry. His head was swiveling in despair. Up to that moment, Tarrou had believed in his own innocence as a man. But from then on, he realizes that to be a citizen subject is to be involved in sanctioned murder every day. No one is exempt or indemnified. Even those who are better than the rest, he explains, cannot present themselves from killing or letting others kill. Such, he says, is the logic by which they live, and we can't stir a finger in this world without bringing the risk of death to somebody. Alienated from his father without telling him why, he becomes an activist for the abolition of the death penalty, but this fails to assuage his guilt. The plague comes to him as no surprise. I had plague already, he opens his monologue, long before I knew this town and this epidemic. He is a carrier, un pestiféré, pestiferous, liable to infect others at every turn. Quote, each of us has the plague within him. No one on earth is free from it. And I know too that we must keep endless watch on ourselves, lest in a careless moment we breathe in somebody's face and fasten the infection on him. The resonances for today with the masks and the breathing and I cannot breathe, George Floyd, are just remarkable. Tarrou has run social distancing into the epicenter of state power. He is pointing the finger at the modern state, which forbids violence to its citizens, not because, as Freud puts it, it desires to abolish it, but because it desires to monopolize it like salt and tobacco. For Tarrou, the responsibility of the citizen for his own violence is not reduced by such fraudulence, but intensifies, since it confronts him with what the state enacts in his name. The plague will continue to crawl out of the woodwork, out of bedrooms, cellars, trunks, handkerchiefs, and old papers, as long as human subjects do not question the cruelty and injustice of their social arrangements. We are all accountable for the ills of the world in which we live. Tarrou aspires to be an innocent murderer, and at one point even to be a saint, by which he means one who recognizes the plague as his problem and fights against it with every breath that he takes. Okay. I began by taking the crisis of the border and the struggle over historical memory in South Africa as two instances that throw the cruelty and injustice of our social arrangements into the starkest relief. So in the final part of these remarks, for the next 20 minutes roughly, let me pick out one or two instances from those realities which seem pertinent to their theme, while also returning to the issue of gender. First, South Africa, where the campaign Rose Must Fall began in 2015, a campaign founded on the historic claim that the struggle to dismantle apartheid had not gone far enough. The new generation, the so-called born frees, felt betrayed by the failure to secure justice in relation to past atrocities, by the persistence of racial inequality and black destitution outside a new black economic elite, by state corruption, by the barely begun project of decolonization, which they argued had been sacrificed on the altar of democracy. Over these past weeks, you will all have heard of the fall of the Rose statue in 2015, as it was the model for the felling of the statue of slave merchant Edward Colston in Bristol, just as it continues to be the point of appeal for those campaigning for the removal of the Rose statue outside Oriel College, Oxford, after a first and unsuccessful attempt in 2015. In fact, as I was recording this, the news came through that Oriel College has now voted in favour of the removal of the statue. But as one of the student activists said, we've been here before, we're not convinced. It's progress, but it doesn't mean it will necessarily happen. We'll have to wait and see. Less prominent in the accounts of the struggle, in fact, the accounts of the protests in South Africa, which spread across the country, they became sort of fees must fall, roads must fall, a general uprising, as it were, against gender-based violence and also against massive racial inequality and disparities. But one thing that I only discovered when I went to South Africa in 2019 is that as part of the same context, the same demand for memory and for historic restitution, the standing of Winnie Mandela in the popular imagination of a significant number of South Africans, regardless of her own acts of violence for which she was indicted in court, has begun to rise. For her persistent struggle way beyond the formal end of apartheid on the part of the racially and economically oppressed. Winnie Mandela was subject to torture under apartheid, a fact little known until the publication of her prison diaries in 2013. Today she is a figurehead for those who are struggling to make the ongoing racial discrimination and destitution of the many visible in South Africa. And this is how Sisonke Msimang concludes her 2018 The Resurrection of Winnie Mandela. Quote, "The past must be opened, not just to grief, but to the structural nature of racism. Just there in the recent past, like the body of a wounded animal hit by a speeding car, there lies the corpse of justice. Whatever her crimes," Msimang argues, "Winnie Mandela will remain on a pedestal, quote, until there is a harder, sterner form of justice, until all the apartheid murderers are named on a public roster so they are known in the world." Grief, the structural nature of racism, bringing the agents of historical racial violence to account. How can we not recognize here the terms of the current pandemic? Above all, the idea that whatever her failings, Winnie Mandela, against the illusions of the nation, is being assigned somewhere a category of truth teller. Quote, "The woman who greeted Nelson Mandela on that sunny day in February 1990, this is Msimang again, on Mandela's release from prison, was morally ambiguous. She spoiled the picture of the perfect revolution that the ANC was intent on creating. She was a reminder that the country was burning." Unlike Winnie Mandela, neither P.W. Botha nor de Klerk have ever been convicted in law for any crime. Winnie Mandela, we might say, has been a scapegoat for an unbearable form of truth about the aftermath of apartheid. She has been punished for revealing what many of those in power are refusing to see, which makes it all the more moving that it has taken the pandemic to bring all these same questions of decolonization, of the university and school curriculum, of historical memory across the world, all of which were at the core of the student protests in South Africa, crashing across the globe onto the city's streets. Okay, let me now return to the question of the border, which is of course one of the scourges of modern times. I realize, by the way, that plague is one of the meanings of scourge, and which figures so centrally in Howard Cagel's account of the distribution and denial of violence by the modern nation state. What has started to emerge recently and become the focus of my attention is the fact that, contrary to another mantra of disaster, women and children first, the border is a site where sexually charged hatred against women seems to find a new and natural place. In July 2019, New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the object of sexually explicit posts by border guards. 9,500 current and former guards are members of a secret Facebook group. After she had reported the horrifying conditions in US border detention centers where detainees reported being abused by officers and women were being forced to drink out of toilets. The post also questioned the authenticity of images which had gone viral of a drowned man, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez, and his daughter Angie Valeria, who had tried to cross the US-Mexican border. This is Cortez speaking. 9,500 Customs and Border Protection officers sharing memes about dead migrants and discussing violence and sexual misconduct towards members of Congress. How on earth can their culture be trusted to care for refugees humanely? Now, migrants has become one of the most urgent political issues of our time, migration. A politics purportedly found on reason and utilitarian logic, the need to get numbers under control for the benefit of all, reveals itself as drenched in sexual hatred. Though the harsh realities of migration make no sexual distinctions, the sea is gender indiscriminate in who it drowns, migration policy appears to take a special pleasure. I was very distressed to discover this, actually, although I shouldn't be surprised, in targeting women. In the Ocasio-Cortez story, scorn of women and migrants were visibly fueling each other, spewed out in the same overexcited, violent run of memes. The post also included Photoshop pictures of Ocasio-Cortez performing oral sex on migrants and on Donald Trump. Now, the border is, of course, one of Trump's most highly charged libidinal objects. At a time when 34% of US households with children do not at this minute have enough to eat, he has just promoted a $500 million project to paint the Mexican wall black. As you will know, the wall is the centerpiece of his program, with rallies echoing to the cry, "Finish the wall," despite the fact that to date, during his presidency, not one portion of the wall has in fact been built. Far from being an object of guilt and denial, as Cagle describes it, violence at the border mutates into a boast. Guilt, uncertainty, and fear in spades in the current moment, mutating into a boast, might be one definition, I suggest, of right-wing populism. And if this has reached a new zenith, it is by no means exclusive, or the policy on migration and deportation is by no means exclusive to Trump's presidency, the boasting is. By 2016, the year of his election, more was already being spent by the US on immigration and border control than on all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. So that is actually under the watch of Barack Obama. In the UK in March 2018, 120 women detainees went on a one-month hunger strike and work strike at Yarl's Wood Immigration Removal Centre for Women in the UK. Several received letters from the Home Office informing them that their deportation would not be paused by their action. In fact, it would more likely accelerate. Serco, the private company running the centre, denied that the hunger strike was taking place. Some of you will know Serco is best known for its policy of changing locks on its properties as a means of evicting asylum seekers living in the community. And despite being fined $6.8 million for its treatment of its tenants, its contract to house asylum seekers was renewed by the Home Office in June 2019. And just this last month, at the height of the COVID pandemic, Serco was also awarded the private contract for test and trace in the teeth of objections based on its past conduct, its villainy, and its complete incompetence. These women were making a number of demands. They were demanding that asylum seekers, minors, pregnant women, survivors of torture, rape and traffic should not be detained. They were calling, in fact, for an end to indefinite detention, a practice which is sanctioned in no other European country apart from the UK. In the US, it was first introduced under the post-9/11 Patriot Act and signed into law under President Obama, the most notorious example being Guantanamo Bay. They were also protesting the conditions under which they were held. 3 years previously, the non-profit London-based Organisation for Women for Refugee Women published a pamphlet describing these conditions under the title "I Am Human." Today, legal entry for refugees, asylum seekers or unskilled workers has been made virtually impossible in the UK. Migration women who try to enter specifically as refugee or asylum seekers are increasingly being criminalised. In 2002, the feminization of irregular migration was already being described as perhaps the most significant migration phenomenon of recent decades. Today, the border is a site of physical and mental abuse. Remember Cagle on the border as the means whereby a nation-state regulates and expels its own violence, attempts catastrophically to hide its own violence from itself. Again, we are talking about what it is permissible to know and not know for the regime of the nation to be able to perpetuate itself. As I read about what is going on at the border here and in the US, I was struck by how much obliteration of knowledge seems to be central to the strategy of border officials in the UK. Objects of sexual taunting and assault, these women are slammed by the system into positions of unwilled ignorance. I didn't know where I was going. They don't explain anything to you. Can you tell me what is happening? And often this forced ignorance takes them right back to the place of unknowing where their journey had begun. In the words of a traffic detainee who had been promised a new life, we were not allowed to ask questions. Not just repressive, what these women experience is closer to a wipeout of identity in which all self-knowledge or self-recognition is lost. I did not know who I was anymore. I do not appear to exist. It's as if you are inside a grave. During a performance organised by Women for Refugee Women at the South Bank in June 2019 as part of UK Refugee Week, one of the women refugees caught in the net of the system apologised. "I'm sorry, I'm thinking too much." Another simply asked, "What will happen to my mind?" In her discussion of psychoanalysis and the pandemic, Kristeva described the mortal uncertainty into which the crisis has plunged every one of us. At the border, that mortal uncertainty becomes policy and is an enforced mode of being, like daily bread. At the border, the uncertainty and doubt, the fear of suffering and death, which Kegel identifies as the barely audible undertone of a philosophical speculation mired in the history of the nation-state, erupts as symptom. It becomes the reality, the inescapable human condition for women who are migrants, the most vulnerable of all, one might say. Now, in the past weeks, the cruelty of the UK migration system has once again been pushed to the fore, notably in relation to the Windrush scandal, which remains without redress. One news item worthy of note, specifically in relation to the pandemic. Forced by public outrage, Johnson agreed to suspend the visa payment requirement for overseas workers in the NHS, having first refused to do so. When he was confronted in the House with the inhumanity of this policy, its blatant contradiction of the weekly clapping of the NHS workers and their characterization as heroes, which has been a bit of a problem, he justified the continuation of the policy in the House and made a brilliant slip when he described the £9 million revenue from the charge as easy, which he immediately corrected to difficult, to replace. But easy, of course, was right. UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak's opening of the public purse during the pandemic has revealed, amongst other things, the financial myth on which the punishing ethos and practice of austerity is now seen brazenly to have relied, another truth revealed by the pandemic. Johnson could easily provide the money and promised loudly to do so. According to the latest report, these charges, which are putting large members of health workers on the brink of destitution, are in fact still in place. They have not been revoked. Today, migration has become a tipping point for the law's relationship to itself. The more this system turns asylum seekers, who are amongst the most vulnerable people in the world, into criminals, the more the law flounders as it runs the risk of exposing the criminality of the state. Criminalisation by the state, writes Michael Grucock with reference to the equally dire policies in Australia, is integral to legitimising criminal activity by the state. Mopping up the migrant population, hoarding them into detention centres, the prisons, the courts in Australia, onto the notorious island camps of Naurus and Manu, where migrants are more or less encaged, a government sweeps its own stables. Of course, criminal activity is integral to capitalist economies, whose increasing neoliberal ruthlessness is one of the key drivers of migration in our time. Behind the sublimated cloak of legality, observes David Harvey, lie overt violence and outright theft. The cruelty of the migration system, including its sexual cruelty, shows the state violently securing its own legitimacy, while in the very same moment visibly floundering in the process as the horrors, dead bodies on the shores, increasingly come to light. In the treatment of migration, the Western powers are chasing their own tail, drawing lines in the sand in the shape of their own vile cunning. This is a cautionary tale of what has already been, and in this worsening political scenario of what is likely to come. Targeting women, refugees and asylum seekers, turning them into criminals, lays bare the pleasure in sexual hatred, alongside the increasingly violent forms of inequality for which women have always been punished, both of which continue to fuel gender injustice across the globe. Today's migrants have become the ultimate scapegoat of a social order whose ever-expanding greed is on course to destroy the very air we breathe, and I wrote that sentence before the death of George Floyd, as if they were the cause of it all, the perfect cargo for blindness, the best way not to see what is truly happening. To summarize, the city-state is plagued by doubt and uncertainty because of the violence of its own origins and the injustice on which it rests. A doubt and uncertainty which touches on the radical insecurity of humankind, which has been so dramatically exacerbated, brought to life by the pandemic. To many of those in power, mainly but not exclusively male leaders, but mainly, that radical insecurity is experienced as something like a narcissistic affront. We then find ourselves confronted by a ratcheting up of false confidence and a denial of historic and structural violence, a lethal combination which only serves to perpetuate and increase the quotient of injustice and of violence in the world we have to face. At the same time, we are being presented with a rare opportunity to expose these truths. The fact that these cruelties are being seized on, called out so loudly by so many, is surely grounds for hope. So long as we do not underestimate just how far the powers that be will go in outlawing the forms of critical self-reflection on the nation's violent history and the brute capacity for ignorance and forgetting which is being mobilized against us. Thank you for listening, and I look forward very much to the discussions that will follow. Thank you so much.